I caught her red-handed, standing in the middle of my stable with one hand on my horse's mane and the other holding her phone like she had every right to be there. "Excuse me," I said, stepping in through the side door. "What the hell are you doing in my stable, Cynthia?" She spun around like she'd just been caught sneaking cookies from the jar. Her perm was frizzed from the humidity, and her oversized sunglasses were halfway down her nose. Classic HOA board member look. "I was doing an inspection," she said, like that explained anything. "We received a complaint about unauthorized livestock."
I blinkte her.
"Livestock? It's a horse. One horse. On my own land. Outside HOA jurisdiction." Cynthia Holbrook, the self-proclaimed queen of the Rosewood Trails HOA, crossed her arms like she owned the whole county. Well, if the animal can be seen from the street, it becomes a visual nuisance. Section 12, Paragraph 3 of the HOA Guidelines. "Read that again, slower," I said, pulling my phone out and starting a recording. "Because I'm pretty sure the stable is behind my house, on 5 acres of land, zoned agricultural, and not under your HOA's authority."
She huffed.
"We're expanding the perimeter. The board voted on it. Your property falls within the proposed boundary." I laughed. "Proposed? Lady, you're trespassing and filming inside my stable. That's not a proposal, that's a crime." Her eyes narrowed. "You can't speak to me like that. I'm the HOA president. And I'm calling the sheriff," I said, already dialing. That made her stumble back a step. "You don't need to do that. I was just trespassing," I cut in, "without permission. And filming. You've got about 30 seconds to explain yourself to the law." By the time Deputy Harris pulled into the gravel driveway, Cynthia was pacing near the tack room, muttering something about bylaws and visual harmony. I met the deputy near the front gate. She entered without permission. She filmed inside, claimed she was doing an inspection, said the HOA was expanding and my land fell under it now. Deputy Harris raised an eyebrow. "Your land's not part of the HOA, Zachary?" "Nope, never was. I've got the original deed. And the zoning maps." "She's making it up." Cynthia tried to butt in, still clutching her phone. "I was acting in official capacity." "No, ma'am," the deputy said. "You were trespassing and video recording on private property without consent. That's not an HOA issue. That's a criminal one." Her face drained of color. I folded my arms and nodded toward the security camera above the stable door. "I've got it all on video, too. Including the part where she touches my horse without permission." Cynthia turned to me like she was about to launch into a full Karen meltdown, but the deputy had already pulled out the cuffs. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for trespassing and invasion of privacy. You have the right to remain silent. You can't arrest me," she shrieked. "I'm the president. And I'm the sheriff," Deputy Harris said, slipping the cuffs on her wrists as she squawked. I watched her get escorted to the cruiser, her fake pearls jangling and her voice getting more shrill with each step. I leaned on the fence post, shaking my head. You'd think that'd be the end of it. But Cynthia wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The cruiser's taillights had barely disappeared down the county road when I noticed a gray sedan idling near the edge of my property. It was parked just beyond the ditch, behind a row of scrub oaks, like whoever was inside didn't want to be seen. I walked down the gravel path toward it, boots crunching against the loose stones. The window rolled down halfway as I approached, revealing a face I hadn't seen in over a year. "Didn't expect to see you again," I said, stopping a few feet from the car door. "What's the HOA's lawyer doing out here?" Richard Langley didn't answer right away. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and glanced back toward the direction the cruiser had gone. "I'm not here in any official capacity," he said. "Cynthia called me in a panic about 20 minutes ago. Said she was being arrested on your land." "She was," I said. "Caught her inside my stable, making up imaginary authority. You want to explain how you're not involved in this expansion scheme she's suddenly pushing? I resigned from the board last fall, he said. Too many backroom decisions.
No transparency.
I told them if they kept pushing into unincorporated zones, they were going to end up in court. And yet you still answer her call, I said. His jaw shifted. She told me you assaulted her, that she was inspecting a safety issue, and you got physical. I stared at him, letting the silence hang long enough to make him squirm. You realize I've got full footage from 2 angles, right? Audio and video. You want a copy? He lowered his gaze.
No.
I believe you. Then why are you really here? He opened the glove box and pulled out a manila envelope, sealed and thick with pages. I kept records, he said, handing it to me. Meeting minutes they never published. Internal memos.
Some of them signed.
You're not the first property they've tried to strong-arm into compliance. The board's been pushing to absorb outlying lots into the HOA. Quietly. No votes from residents. Just false notices and intimidation. I took the envelope and opened it right there, flipping through the first few pages. Typed notes, timestamps, scanned copies of unsigned letters. One memo caught my eye dated 3 months ago, with Cynthia's signature at the bottom. It listed target properties for visual improvement enforcement. My address was at the top of the list. They're calling it soft annexation, Richard said. They don't file official paperwork. They just start enforcing rules and hope no one pushes back. That's not just unethical, I said. That's fraud. He nodded. I told them as much. But they said if people stood up to it, they'd just drag it out in court until they settled or gave up. I closed the envelope. Well, that's not going to work on me. I figured, he said. That's why I brought this. And something else. He reached into his jacket and handed me a USB drive. That's the audio from the last board meeting I attended. Cynthia didn't realize I was recording that night. She said some things you'll want to hear. I took it and slipped it into my jeans pocket. You're not doing this out of guilt, are you?
No, he said.
I'm doing it because I know how far she'll go if no one stops her. And she's not acting alone. A light drizzle had started by the time he drove off, but I stood there a few more minutes, envelope under my arm, watching the last of the sun dip behind the hills. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Back inside, I set the documents on my kitchen table and got to work. I made copies of everything, backed up the audio in 3 locations, and started matching the names in the memos to properties around the area. Over a dozen addresses, some less than a mile from mine. I knew 2 of the families personally. I made some calls. By the next morning, 7 of us were sitting on my back porch, sipping coffee and flipping through the evidence. Rick and Dana from the old farmhouse down the road. Mrs. Gutierrez, who ran the animal rescue. And Tyler, a retired Marine who'd been fined last year for unsightly fencing, even though he didn't live in the HOA either. This explains everything, he said, tapping the memo with his index finger. They sent me a notice last fall claiming I owed back dues. I thought it was a scam. It was, I said. But a very organized one. Rick leaned forward. So what do we do? Go to the sheriff with this? Not yet, I said. Not until we've got a full picture. I want to know how deep this goes. Who's signing what? Where the money's going. Dana looked up from the stack of papers. You think they're funneling HOA fees into this expansion? Wouldn't be surprised, I said. If they're not keeping minutes properly, there's no accountability. We need someone who understands that system inside and out. Mrs. Gutierrez raised her hand. My niece's partner used to work in HOA compliance. Quit after they tried to push through a fraudulent landscaping contract. He might be willing to help. Get him on the phone, I said. We've got more than enough to open a formal complaint. But if we can tie it to financial misconduct, that's when the state gets involved. 2 days later, I was sitting across from an independent auditor named Malcolm Brewster, flipping through deposit records printed on legal paper. He'd pulled financials from the HOA's public filings and compared them with what residents had reported paying. "There's a discrepancy here," he said, pointing to a highlighted line. "Over $20,000 in administrative costs last quarter. No itemized breakdown. That's unusually high for a neighborhood this size." "Think they're moving funds around?" I asked. "Possibly. But it's what's missing that's more interesting. You see this?" He pointed to a gap on the ledger. "There's no record of where this check was deposited. Just a note. Expansion initiative. That's not an expense category." Exactly. That night, I emailed the deputy who'd responded to Cynthia's arrest. I didn't send everything, just enough to get his attention. A few scanned documents, a snippet of the audio recording, and a summary of what we'd uncovered. He called me back within an hour. "We've suspected something was off with that HOA for a while," he said. "But we didn't have anything that'd stick. You're telling me they're operating outside their charter and misusing funds. I'm telling you they're annexing land without legal authority and collecting dues under false pretenses." He exhaled slowly. "All right. I'll forward this to the county prosecutor. But you need to be careful. These people sound desperate." "I'm not worried about desperate," I said. "I'm worried about how many people they've already steamrolled." The next morning, subpoenas were issued. The local paper caught wind of it within hours. A full investigation was launched into the HOA's finances and governance. Cynthia made bail, of course, but her house was swarmed with reporters before noon. She tried to spin it, claimed she was being targeted for trying to beautify the community, but the news outlets had already run with the story. HOA president arrested for trespassing, now facing fraud investigation, and just like that, the queen of Rosewood Trails was dethroned. But things weren't over. Because tucked inside the last page of one of those memos was a name I didn't recognize. Not a board member. Not even a resident. A developer. Which meant this wasn't just about control. It was about profit. And land. And I had a feeling we'd only just uncovered the surface. The first time I saw the developer's name, Alan Bristow, I was standing in the county records office, leaning over a laminated counter while a clerk printed off parcel transfer documents. His name wasn't on any board rosters or public HOA filings, but it did appear next to something much more interesting, a series of intent to purchase agreements tied to properties just outside the HOA's original boundary, including mine. The clerk handed me a manila folder and adjusted her glasses. "I don't usually comment on this stuff," she said, lowering her voice slightly, "but that name's been popping up a lot lately. Quiet purchases. Mostly cash. Always through a shell LLC." I flipped the folder open. The agreements were vague, just enough legal jargon to look official without committing to anything, but the names of surrounding properties were unmistakable. 5 were already listed as pending. 2 had been transferred in the past month. And none of the owners I knew had mentioned selling. I turned to her. "These transfers, were they contested at all?" She shook her head. "Not publicly. But if I were you, I'd look into how those sales were initiated." Back at home, I dug into the paperwork deeper. The LLC's listed address was a P.O. box in a neighboring county. The registered agent? A law firm I'd never heard of. I made a call to one of the property owners, a man named Clay, who operated a tree nursery on the edge of the woods. I hadn't seen him much in the past year, not since his wife passed. "You didn't sell your land, did you?" I asked. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, "I signed something back in January. A rep from the HOA came by. Said they were working with the county to create a greenbelt. Told me if I signed early, they'd cover my back taxes." "Did you get a copy of what you signed?"
"No."
"They said it'd be mailed." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Clay, you didn't sell to the county. You sold to a private LLC. They're planning a development." He went quiet again. "They lied, didn't they?"
"Yeah."
"They did. By the time I hung up, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just HOA overreach or a power-hungry board president. This was a coordinated land grab, masked as neighborhood beautification. And if they tricked Clay into signing over 20 acres under false pretenses, they'd try it again. I drove to the district attorney's office the next morning with the folder in hand. Not the sheriff. Not a deputy. This had jumped the fence into prosecutorial territory. I was ushered into an office with tall windows and a bookcase full of leather-bound volumes nobody had opened in years. The DA, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Park, listened without interrupting as I laid it all out: Cynthia's arrest, the forged authority, the financial oddities, and now the fraudulent land transfers. When I opened the folder and slid it across the desk, she leaned forward, scanning the documents. "These are copies?" she asked.
No.
"Originals. From the records office. I've got scans, though." She flipped a few more pages. "This LLC, have you traced its ownership?" "Only as far as the registration firm. But Alan Bristow's name is on the intent to purchase forms. And he's been quietly circling these parcels for months." She closed the folder with a soft snap. "This fits with a complaint we received 2 weeks ago. An elderly couple filed a report claiming they were pressured into selling by a man using HOA letterhead. They couldn't remember his name." I leaned back slightly. "Did they mention what he looked like?" "Tall, mid-50s. Expensive watch. Drove a black SUV. Matches the photos I pulled off a security camera last month," I said. "He visited a property near mine. Never got out of the car, just sat there watching." She stood and walked to a file cabinet, pulling out a binder and flipping through it. After a moment, she retrieved a photo. "This him. Alan Bristow.
Clean-shaven.
Silver cufflinks. The kind of man who wore a suit to a dirt road." "That's him," I said. "He's working with Cynthia and the board, using the HOA as a smokescreen." She nodded once. "Leave the documents with me. If you have any other residents willing to come forward, get statements. I'll open an inquiry today. If what you're saying holds up, we're looking at conspiracy to commit fraud, illegal land acquisition, and potentially elder abuse. Do you want the audio recordings too?" "Every copy you've got." By the end of the day, subpoenas went out to the HOA's financial institutions, communications records, and Bristow's LLC. The county seized control of the HOA's operating accounts pending investigation, and a temporary injunction was filed against any further land acquisitions under the HOA's name. But what really turned the tide wasn't legal. It was personal. Tyler, the retired Marine, showed up at my place the next morning with a folder of his own handwritten notes, time-stamped photos, and one very telling letter marked "Confidential." It had been slipped under his door 2 nights prior. "This was meant for someone else," he said, laying it on my porch table. "Wrong house. But it's addressed to Bristow. From Cynthia." I opened the envelope. Inside was a typed letter, dated 2 days before her arrest. It outlined a plan to accelerate negotiations with remaining property owners and utilize code enforcement pressure to encourage compliance. It also referenced bonus compensation once the final parcels were acquired. The kicker? It was signed with Cynthia's full name and title, HOA President. "Bonus compensation," I read aloud. She was getting paid for this. Tyler nodded. "Which means the rest of the board might have been too." I took the letter straight to the DA's office. Park read it once, then twice. Her mouth tightened. "This letter confirms intent to defraud," she said. "And if they received compensation from a private developer in exchange for abusing HOA authority, that's public corruption." Within 48 hours, arrest warrants were issued for Cynthia and 2 additional board members. One was picked up at a golf course, the other while boarding a flight to Arizona. Cynthia, already out on bail, was rearrested and charged with conspiracy and bribery. But the fire hadn't stopped spreading. A whistleblower came forward from inside the developer's office. A junior analyst who had been tasked with reviewing purchase proposals stumbled onto emails detailing how Bristow coordinated with the HOA to identify soft targets, owners who were elderly, financially struggling, or unaware of their rights. The analyst, fearing legal blowback, handed over everything: internal memos, payment records, and a spreadsheet tracking compliance pressure efforts. That spreadsheet listed every property outside the HOA's boundary. Mine was highlighted in red. The story exploded in the media. Local stations ran special segments. State investigators arrived within a week. A class action lawsuit was filed by over a dozen property owners, and calls rang out across the county for legislative reform on how HOAs operate. But the most satisfying moment came 1 week later. A town hall was called in the Rosewood Trails Community Center. Not by the HOA, but by the residents. Over 100 people showed up. The chairs were packed. People stood along the back wall. And I was asked to speak first. I kept it brief. They tried to take our land. They used fear, lies, and fake authority. But we stood up. We exposed them. And we're not done. Applause broke out, but it wasn't for me. It was for the people seated beside me: Clay, Mrs. Gutierrez, Tyler, and half a dozen others who refused to roll over. The board was dissolved by court order 2 days later. A court-appointed trustee took over operations until a new volunteer committee could be formed with restrictions, oversight, and zero authority outside the original boundaries. Cynthia's trial was scheduled for the fall. Bristow's assets were frozen. And the land he thought he could quietly acquire? It was now protected under a conservation easement donated by the very residents he tried to deceive. The stable? Still standing. The horse? Still healthy. And me? I installed a new gate. Reinforced. With a sign that read, in large, clear letters, private property. Not under HOA jurisdiction. And just beneath it, trespassers will be documented. Then prosecuted. Nobody's ignored it since. The courtroom was packed. Not just with reporters and county officials, but with residents, people who had never set foot inside a courthouse before now. Folks who'd planted roots generations deep in the valley, and others who'd just moved in and found themselves swept up in the mess. There were no empty seats. Even the bailiff looked surprised by the turnout. I stood near the back, arms crossed, watching Cynthia Holbrook in the defendant's chair. Her blazer was a shade darker than usual, her hair pulled tight like it might hold her together. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the judge either. Judge Mary Colton adjusted her glasses as the clerk finished reading the charges. Conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery, criminal trespass, unlawful surveillance, attempted coercion under false authority. When the last count was read, the courtroom sat in dead silence. "Do you understand the charges, Miss Holbrook?" the judge asked. She nodded slowly.
Ido.
Her voice was smaller than I remembered. It didn't carry the same force she'd used when standing on porches, barking citations at people over mailbox colors and trash placement. The prosecution stood. "Your Honor, the state would like to present new evidence recently submitted by the Office of County Records. It pertains to falsified documentation used to initiate property transfers under the guise of municipal expansion." Judge Colton nodded. "Proceed." The assistant DA handed over a binder, thick with notarized forms and signature comparisons. 1 page at a time, the judge flipped through them. Her frown deepened. "These signatures," she said, "they've been verified as forgeries?" "Correct," the prosecutor said. 3 separate handwriting experts have confirmed that Ms. Holbrook, along with 2 other board members, signed on behalf of private landowners without their consent. In one case, the owner was hospitalized out of state at the time of signing. A murmur swept through the room. Cynthia's lawyer stood and requested a recess, citing emotional distress. The judge declined. Across the aisle, I caught sight of Richard Langley. He sat alone, hands folded on his lap, watching with a kind of grim detachment. He hadn't spoken much since handing over the internal memos, but he'd made it clear he'd testify if asked. So far, he hadn't needed to. The witness list was already long. Tyler took the stand first. He laid out the pressure he'd experienced, the false notices, the threats of liens. He answered each question calmly, but with a steel edge in his voice that made the jury lean in. They wanted me to back down, he said. Said I owed money for rules I never agreed to. But when I asked for proof, they sent people to take pictures of my yard, my fence, my dog. And then they left those pictures in my mailbox without postage. Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Gutierrez followed. She described the day Cynthia parked outside her rescue shelter, clipboard in hand, demanding access to verify compliance. She'd refused and called the sheriff. But the next week, an anonymous complaint was filed labeling her property as a biohazard. The prosecutor held up the complaint. Do you recognize this handwriting? Yes, she said, without hesitation. It's Cynthia's. By the time Clay spoke, his voice shaking as he described being manipulated into signing away his land, the jury's expressions had hardened. Not out of outrage, but something colder. Something final. Then came the forensic accountant. He testified that over $90,000 had been moved through shell accounts linked to Bristow's LLC. A portion of those funds had been traced to personal accounts belonging to Cynthia and her two co-defendants. The transactions were spaced out, concealed as consulting fees and neighborhood planning stipends. None of it had been disclosed in HOA filings. The final nail came from the whistleblower at Bristow's firm. She appeared via video conference, her face half lit by the glow of a monitor. Her statement was direct, factual, and devastating. They used the HOA structure as a pipeline, she said. It was never about neighborhood improvements. It was about acquiring land without paying market value. Cynthia coordinated the targeting. Bristow handled the capital. And the board approved the pressure strategies. Cynthia's attorney didn't cross-examine. He just sat there, stone-faced. When the prosecution rested, the judge called for closing statements. Cynthia declined to speak. The jury didn't take long. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week, but the judge issued a remand order immediately. Cynthia was led from the courtroom in cuffs, again, but this time, there'd be no bail. Her two accomplices were taken into custody as well, their attempts to delay proceedings denied. Outside, the mood was different than I expected. No cheering. No celebration. Mostly quiet relief. Rick walked up beside me as we watched the crowd disperse. Feels like we just cut out a tumor, he said. Yeah, I replied. Now we rebuild. In the days that followed, the court-appointed trustee held an emergency meeting. Residents voted to dissolve the HOA's enforcement arm entirely. From now on, they'd function as a volunteer neighborhood association, no power, no dues, just a way to organize block parties and share information. And Bristow? He fled the state before indictments were issued. But federal charges were forthcoming. The Department of Housing and Urban Development had opened an investigation into similar activities in 2 other counties. His assets, including the holdings under the Shell LLC, were frozen. Every parcel acquired under the fraudulent scheme was ordered returned to its original owners. Clay got his land back. So, did the elderly couple who'd been intimidated into signing papers they didn't understand. And as for me, I went back to working the land, rebuilding the split-rail fence, fixing the back gate, and tending to the stable without someone lurking around pretending they had authority. One afternoon, I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address. Just a folded sheet of paper inside. It read, "Thanks for not backing down." There was no signature, but I had a feeling it came from someone who'd been watching quietly, waiting to see if anyone would finally stand up. I didn't keep the letter. I didn't need to. People had already started taking more interest in their rights, in the laws that governed their land. And not just in our area. Word had spread. Other neighborhoods started scrutinizing their HOAs, demanding transparency, questioning fines that didn't make sense. Change was slow, but it had started. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridgeline, a truck pulled up to my driveway. Tyler stepped out, carrying a cardboard box. "I found something in the old board storage unit," he said, handing it to me. "Thought you should see it." Inside were old meeting notes, some dating back over a decade. Most were unremarkable budget discussions, event planning, but tucked near the bottom was a document labeled Vision 2025. I read through it once, then twice. It outlined a plan to unify all land within a 5-mile radius under a single governing body, complete with mandatory landscaping standards, architectural reviews, and a clause giving the HOA first right of refusal on property sales. It had been drafted 5 years ago. "Guess this was the long game," I said. "Not anymore," Tyler replied. "We burned that bridge." I nodded and lit the fire pit. The pages curled and blackened, the ink vanishing into smoke. Tyler stood beside me, arms crossed, watching the flames. "They won't try this again," he said. "No," I agreed. "But if they do, we'll be ready." Because once you've seen how power gets abused, how it wraps itself in rules and titles and fake authority, you don't unsee it. You get sharper, louder, and you make damn sure it doesn't happen again. The land was quiet after that. Not silent, but peaceful. No more surprise visits. No more fake citations. Just the sound of horses in the stable, whine through the grass, and the occasional neighbor stopping by to borrow a tool or share a harvest. We didn't need an HOA to build a community. All we needed was each other, and the will to say enough when someone tried to take what wasn't theirs. And this time, we'd made sure they wouldn't forget it.